this course, I'm going to teach you how to authenticate your APIs using JWT or JSON Web Tokens. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about access and refresh tokens, and we're going to be authenticating our protected routes using access and refresh tokens. So I had already prepared this README file that just outlines the steps that we are going to be following. So you can always make reference back to it if you have any questions. Now, if you want to also get all the code in this video, there's going to be a link in the description below. Now, let's begin. So the first thing is I would like to explain how access and refresh tokens work. Now, if you see this picture, this image is an illustration of how it actually works. So this is the first time login. We have the client's machine, which is your computer or your phone, and you put in your login details, let's say your username and your email, or username, email, password, any of them. And then those details get sent to the server. So once those details get authenticated and validated, and we've seen that these credentials are correct and there is a user with this login details, the server is now going to respond with access and refresh tokens. Now, this is the first time login. So when you go to a website that uses JWT and access and refresh tokens, once you put in your login details and then the server is able to validate that those login details are correct, it is going to send back an access and refresh token. Now, I'm going to explain exactly what these access and refresh tokens are. But if we move to the next image, here it says when an access token expires. So an access token basically allows us to authenticate a user for visiting protected routes or protected endpoints. So let's say, for example, now we have an endpoint that only a logged in user can make a request to. What we can do is when we want to make a request to that endpoint, we have to pass in the access token in the headers so that Django can get the access token and authenticates the user to see if the user is properly authenticated using the access token. So the access token just basically helps us to authenticate the users when they are making a request to a protected route or a protected endpoint. Now, what if the access token expires? Because an access token obviously does not last forever because it's not like a password. It lasts only for a specific amount of time which we can set. Now, once that token expires, this is what we can also do. So let's say the token expires, the access token expires. What we're going to do is we're going to make use of that refresh token to generate a new access and refresh token. So that refresh token basically helps us to generate a new access token. So that is why when we first log in, we are being returned an access token and a refresh token. We use the access token to authenticate the user when you're visiting a protected route. And then we use a refresh token to generate a new access token anytime the original one has expired. Because access tokens and refresh tokens both have an expiration time that are given to them for security reasons, obviously, because we don't want a case where an access token which was generated 90 days ago is still valid. I mean, you could technically do that, but that is not really safe. So that is what the refresh token is for. The client machine sends a request to the refresh endpoint, and then the server responds with a new access token and refresh token. Now, this is making a request to a protected route. So this last image just shows exactly how everything comes together. So we have the client's machine right here. The client's machine sends a request to the server for the refresh token, and then the client's machine gets back an access token. Now, using that access token, the client can make a request to the server to a protected route or to a protected endpoint. Now, once the server is able to authenticate the user using that access token, then the server responds with a request. Now, it responds with a request, maybe containing the data that was present in that protected route or protected endpoint. So this is just like an illustration. The client sends the access token to the server validates it, and then returns back the response. So if the access token is wrong, the client is going to get an error back. So if you have any questions so far, please just leave the question in the comment section and I am going to reply you. So that is just an overall explanation of how access and refresh tokens work in JWT with JWT in Python or Django rather. Now we are going to get started with setting up the Django project because obviously we need to set up the project before we can start adding JWT into it. Now, I would just like to show you that I am currently in VS Code and I had created a project folder called JWT Projects Tutorial. Now, you can create a folder and name it whatever you want. But for me, I created mine and named it this. And I have opened that specific folder in Visual Studio Code because this is where I want to be working in. So let's start by setting up the project. Let me just zoom in here. So the first step is that we need to create and enter the desired directory for project setup. That is what I had just showed you when I said I created a directory called or a folder called JWT Project Tutorial. Now the next step is that we need to create a virtual environment using pipenv or other means. Now it is just good practice to always create a virtual environment anytime you are creating a new Django project so that all your dependencies are kept in one place. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a virtual environment using the pipenv library. So if you have any special way of creating your own virtual environment, like virtual env, you can use that. But for me, I like using pipenv, the pipenv library. So if you want to follow my way, the first thing that you need to do is install this library by running the command pip install pipenv. Now, I already have it installed, so it will probably say requirements already satisfied. But for you, it's just install. So when that is done, I'll clear out my screen. Now, the next thing that we need to run is simply this command called pipenv shell. Now, what this command is going to do is it's going to create a new virtual environment inside your present working directory. So once I run that, it's going to create a virtual environment inside JWT project tutorial. And the moment it creates that virtual environment, it's going to activate it immediately. So that is why I love this library. The moment it creates a virtual environment, it just activates it for us. So you can see it says creating virtual environment. Okay, now our virtual environment has been created successfully. As you can see, it says successfully created virtual environment. Now, the virtual environment is already activated by default anytime you run command to create a new virtual environment. Now, for a side note, I would also just like to explain how to deactivate and reactivate this virtual environment if you're making use of this library with me. So right now, my virtual environment is activated. All I have to do to deactivate it is just type exit. Now, once I do that, it's going to deactivate the virtual environment. Now, if I want to reactivate it, I just simply run pipenv shell again, and it's going to reactivate that virtual environment as you saw here, or as you see here. This is launching social and virtual environment. I'm just going to clear out my screen now since my virtual environment is activated. Now, the next step is that we need to install Django and Django REST framework because, obviously we're working with Django and Django REST framework. I'm just going to copy this command and I'm going to run them here. Now, if you want to get this README file, like I explained earlier, there's a GitHub repository that if you visit, there's a link in the description. Once you visit that link, it'll take you to GitHub repository where you can get the project files along with this README so that you can follow with me also. Now, once I run that, we can see that it's installing Django and Django REST framework. All right. So right now we have installed Django and Django REST framework. The next step we need to take is we need to create a new Django project called authentication project. Now you can call it whatever you want, but I will just call mine authentication project for the sake of this tutorial. I'm going to copy this command, which is going to help us create a new Django project. Django-admin space start project space the project's name, which is called authentication project. Now I'm just going to run that. Now I'm running through this installation because I assume you already have some basic knowledge of Django. Now once I type ls or dir, I can see the content of this folder and I can see that my project folder has been created already. I'm going to go ahead and cd into that projects folder and then I'm going to type ls to see the content. So I can see my manage.py file has been generated and projects folder. Now, the next step that we are going to take is that we are going to create an app called core. I'm just going to copy this command right here. And let me clear out my screen. And I'll run it. Python manage.py start app call. So we're creating an application folder called core. Now core is going to be where we're going to, the core is where we're going to write the main logic of this program. Now, the next step we need to take is we need to open the projects folder in your code editor. Now, I already have it open here, and you can see the project folders already, the project and the app folders already shown here because I just created them. Now, the next step is that we need to add the app core and the REST framework to the project installed app settings. So what I'm going to do is I will head to my settings.py file. And the first thing that I need to do is I need to add the app core, because obviously we have just created an app called core and we need to let Django know that we have an app called core. So we're adding it to the installed apps. So I'll just type core there. Now the next thing we need to add is REST framework. REST framework. Because anytime we are making use of REST framework, it's a separate app itself. So when you install it, you need to add REST framework to the installed apps to let Django know that it's installed. Now, the next step is that we need to create URLs for the app and register them in the project URLs. So what that simply means is that we need to create an independent URLs file in the core app. I'm just going to create a URL file right here. I'll call it urls.py. So we don't want to be creating all our URLs inside the projects folder. We want to keep everything separate so that it's nice and clean. So inside this URLs file, I'm just going to write a few things. I'm going to say from Django.urls import path. Now, after importing path, the next thing I'm going to do is I'll say from dots import views. Now, what that means is that from this present working directory, import the views.py file. So that is what from dots means, because we just want to import the views that we are going to write eventually from the views file. Now, I'm just going to create a URL patterns list, and I'll equate this to an empty list. So this is where we are going to be writing all our URL patterns for our application folder. Now, the next step is that we need to go to the project folder and we need to register this urls.py file. We need to add it to our URL patterns list in the project folder URL. So what I'm just going to do is right here from Django.urls, I'm going to import include. Then after doing that, we just want to tell Django to include the URLs which are present in the core application folder. I'm just going to leave this URL, this endpoint empty, and I'm going to pass in. So after putting that comma right now, what we're just going to do is we're going to pass in include. And after passing in include, we need to write the path to the URL we're trying to point to. I'm just going to say core.urls. So we're telling Django that we want you to include all the URLs or all the paths that are present in the core.urls file. Now, after doing that, I will just save it and close it. Now, the next step is that we need to return hello world from a view to test the setup. So what we just want to do is we just want to return like a default, we just want to return something to test that our project setup worked successfully. So I'm just going to come to my views in my app folder, and I will copy all of this and I will explain exactly what it is. So let me just paste that. Now, the first thing is we're importing from REST framework.response. We are importing response. And then from REST framework.decorators, we're importing the API view. So this response just basically helps us return a response from an endpoint. Now, the next thing is this API view. Now, this API view is a decorator that helps us tell Django exactly what kind of HTTP request methods this specific endpoints allows. So when we say get, it means we can only send get requests to this endpoint. Now, if you notice, there are yellow lines here. That is because I need to set my proper Python interpreter. So I will just select that. And once I select that, the error should disappear soon. So after doing this, after pasting all of this code into it, what we just need to do is we need to map that view to a specific URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come here and I will save this file. And then the next thing is I'm going to open my URL in my app folder. Now I'm going to create a URL for it for this view so that I can map this view to a specific URL. So what I'm going to do is I'll say path, and in here I'll pass in a quote. Now after passing in the quote, I'm just going to say views dot home. Now what this basically means is that I'm trying to map the base URL. Now the base URL is 127.0.0.1 but 8,000. I'm trying to map the base URL to this view which I had created here. So let me just fix this error right here. So I'm trying to map that base URL to this specific view so that when I visit localhost port 8000, this specific view is going to be returned to me. Now, once I have done that, all I need to do is just test the code to see if it works. So I'm going to head back to my terminal and I'm going to run the server. I'm going to run python manage.py run server. So once I run that, it's going to start the local development server for us. And I have an error saying no module called core.urls. So URLs. So let me just, okay, I name this url.py instead of urls.py. So let me just save that. And once I save that, I'll break out of my server and I will run it again. So make sure your URL is called urls.py. So we can see that the server is running now. So I'm just going to visit localhost on port 8000. And once I do that, we should see a response. So now it shows us an error saying no such table Django session. So the reason why we are seeing this error is because we hadn't applied the 18 on a, we have 18 unapplied migrations. So once we apply these migrations, that error is going to disappear. So I'm just going to stop the server here and I'm going to run python manage.py migrate. Now, once I run migrate, it's just apply all these changes to the database. Now I'm going to clear out my screen and I will run the server again. So once I run it, I will head back to my browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you can see that we are being returned uh, some text here saying hello world. Now, this is coming from this response, which we had returned from this specific view. And you can see that we are being given this nice UI. This is coming from Django REST framework, which is the UI that it gives by default. So I'm going to be working with this UI a lot. And if you would like to work with Postman or any other API clients, you can, but I'll just be working from the browser itself. So now we can see that our setup is working successfully and we've been able to return hello world and we are good to go. We're going to move to the next step right now. The next step is that we need to create a super user. So we need to create a super user because we want to be able to, access the admin dashboard, and we just want to be able to use that user account, the super user account. We are going to be using it to test out our endpoint, see if it works properly. So I'm going to run this command called python manage.py create super user. So I'll head back to my terminal, stop the server, clear my screen, and paste it. So it's just going to ask me to create a super user. And to ask me for username, I'll just put admin, email address, admin@gmail.com. Password, I'll put in password, put it again. Okay, passwords did not match. Password is too short, I'll say yes. Now, once I do that, the super user gets created for us successfully. So we have an admin account and we have just one account so far in our Django project. Now, the next step that we need to take is that we need to install Simplejwt JWT and configure the token endpoint. Now, this is where the main event actually happens in our application. So what I'm going to do is I will just, first of all, visit the documentation for Simplejwt JWT because this is what we are going to be making use of in order to add this feature to our API. So I will just copy that URL and paste it inside my browser. Now, once I do that, we are going to be brought to this page that shows us basically how to get started with Simplejwt JWT. So what I'm going to do is I will follow these steps. Now, the first thing is we need to install Simplejwt JWT. because simple JWT is one of the ways of authenticating our API. So for example, now if I go to a different browser and search Django REST framework, and once that opens, I will go to the official documentation. Now, once we get to documentation, I will search for API guide, and under API guide, I will go to authentication. Now, under authentication, we are going to go to JSON Web Token Authentication. So under JSON Web Token Authentication, it says JSON Web Token is a fairly new standard which can be used for token-based authentication. So I just wanted to show you that this is exactly what we are following. And it suggests that we use Django REST Framework Simple JWT. Now, this is exactly what I have opened here. So we're going to be following the documentation in order to set up Simple JWT. So you can see that it's one of the ways of authenticating our APIs from the official Django REST Framework documentation. Now, there are a bunch of other ones that we can use, but we're just going to be using this. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to install Simple JWT. So I will just copy this command right here, which is already what I have outlined here. And once I copy it, I will just head back to my terminal and paste it. So this is just going to install the Simple JWT library for us, which is what we need. So right now we can see that it's installed. So I'll just clear my terminal screen right now. So the next step is that we need to add simple JWT authentication classes to settings.py file. So if I head back to the documentation, it says that we need to add, it says then your Django projects must be configured to use the library. In the settings.py, add this to the list of authentication classes. So what I'm going to do is I will just copy it from here. Now, once I copy it from here, I will head to my settings.py file. And right after my installed apps or anywhere, I'm going to paste it. So what exactly does this mean? What this means is that we want to add simple JWT authentication as one of the default authentication classes. So we need to do this because obviously we want to make use of simple JWT. And in order to make use of it, we need to add it as the default authentication. We need to add it as one of the default authentication classes so that we can actually make use of it. So that's why it says REST framework simple JWT authentication.jwt authentication. Now, after adding this, the next step, according to the README file, is that we need to, okay, it says here we are trying to set simple JWT as one of the default authentication methods. Now, the next step is that we need to set up access and refresh token endpoints. So I'm just going to save this. So after saving it, what we need to do, according to the README file again, is that we need to set up access and refresh token endpoints. Now, these endpoints are actually what are now going to help us make requests and get our access and refresh tokens. So these endpoints can be given to us by default from simple JWT. So right off the bat, we could just get started by we can just get started authenticating our APIs really quick. So if we head back to the documentation, you can see that it's also part of the page. It says also in your root urls.py file or any other URL config, include routes to the simple JWT, token pair view, and token refresh views. So what I will just do is, I'm just going to copy all of this and I will explain what it does. After copying it, it says head to your urls.py file in app folder and add the folder. So I will do just that. I'm just going to come here and paste it. And then I will remove this home URL and paste it here. Now, let's explain what this is. So we said from REST framework.simplejwt.views, what we're doing is we're importing two class views, which are token obtain pair view and token refresh view. Now, the token obtain pair view, this view basically helps us get the access and the refresh token from this specific endpoint. So anytime a user wants to log in, this is the endpoints that they're actually going to hit. Now, once they hit this endpoint, it's going to generate an access token and a refresh token for that user. So it's generating a pair of tokens, access and refresh. That's why it's called token obtain pair view. Now, if you're in VS Code, you can decide to take a look at it. You can press Ctrl, hover over it, and click it. And once you do that, you can see the actual code for the view. but I'm just going to close it and continue. So we can now see in the URL, the path is API forward slash token. And then we're saying token obtained per view dot as view. We're saying dot as view because it is a class-based view. Now, if we want to pass class-based views into our URLs, we need to add dot as view. Unlike here, where we just called views.home because we had created a function-based view. Now, after doing that, we just give it a name of token obtained per. Now, the next endpoint is the token refresh view. Now, this is the endpoint that a user this is the endpoint that a client is going to hit anytime they want to generate a new access token and refresh token. Now, remember that when I was explaining, I mentioned that the access tokens sometimes, or not even sometimes, the access token eventually expires. And when it expires, the client machine now needs to make a request to the refresh endpoint so that a new access token and a new refresh token can be generated. Now, I'm going to explain why we are generating a new refresh token later on and you will understand. But for now, I just want you to know that anytime an access token expires, the client machine needs to make a request to the server, get a new access and refresh token. So that is exactly what this endpoint is for. It's called refresh because we are generating a new refresh token from this endpoint, and it is a class-based view. Now, once you do that, I want you to just save it. Now, after saving it, we can actually go and test this out. So it says the next step says test these endpoints in your browser or Postman to get access and refresh tokens. So what I'm going to do is after saving this URL, I will just visit this URL in my browser. So it's API forward slash token. So I will go to my browser and I'm going to go to localhost forward slash API forward slash token. Now, once I visit this endpoint, let me zoom in here. Okay, I have to run my server. I'm just going to run python manage.py run server. Now, once that is running, I will go back to my browser. So we have an error. It says attribute error, URL pattern object has no attribute path. So let's go back to the URL and check what error it is. So here I put a full stop instead of a comma. So that is where the error is. Once I do that, it should reload without any issue. So now I'm just going to go back to the web browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you can see that we are brought to this endpoint. Let me just zoom in. It says token obtain pair. It says takes a set of user credentials and returns access and refresh JSON web token pair to prove the authentication of those credentials. So this has been given to us by default from this class right here, token obtain pair view. So this has been given to us by default. And you can see here that it says detail, method get is not allowed. Now that is because for this specific endpoint, it only accepts a post request. Now that post request is going to come in when you fill in your username and your password. Now once you fill in these details, it's going to be sent as a post request to this specific endpoint. Now once it hits that endpoint, it's now going to come in as a post request, and then it checks if those credentials are okay, and if they're okay, it returns an access and a refresh token. But let's test it out to see. Let's say I enter wrong details and I hit post. Let's see what it gives us. Now it says details, no active account found with the given credentials. What I'm going to do is I will just now type in the correct credentials which I had created. Remember that we had created a super user. So it is a super user details that I'm going to use to fill this form. So once I fill that form right now, you can see that this is a response that is being returned back to us, which is very, very nice. We are seeing the access token, which has been generated for us. And we are also seeing the refresh token, which has been generated for us. So anytime we want to make a request to a protected endpoint or a protected route, we need to make use of the access token in order to authenticate ourselves properly. Now, once this access token has expired, we are now going to make use of this refresh token in order to generate a new access token. So let's just test out this refresh endpoint. So I will head back to the url.py file and I will copy this refresh endpoint URL right here. And I'll create a new tab I'm going to go to localhost. Sorry, I'm going to go to localhost forward slash that specific endpoint, which is the token refresh endpoint. Now, once I visit it, you can see that this again is being given to us, and this response is coming from this class view, token refresh view dot as view. It's being given to us by default by Simplejwt. Now it says it takes a refresh type JSON web token and returns access type JSON web token if the refresh token is valid. So what this means is that anytime our access token has, let's say our access token, which we are just generated, let's say it is no longer valid, what we can do is we can now take this refresh token right here, which was generated for us. I'm just going to copy it. Now, once I copy it, I can come back to this view, and where we have refresh, I'm going to paste it in, and I'm going to click post. Now, once I send it, you can see that a new access token has now been generated for us. So if, for example, I enter an invalid refresh token, let me just add something else there. Once I hit post, you'll see that it says token not valid. Token is invalid or expired. So that way, anytime we have a refresh token, we can then use that specific refresh token to generate a new access token. Now, the question might come into your mind of, but how many times can we make use of a refresh token to generate a new access token? As I had just showed you, I used one refresh token to generate two new access tokens. Now, this can be really bad because if a malicious party gets hand of a refresh token that has been generated for a user, what that means is that using that refresh token, that malicious party or the let's just say hacker, for example, can make use of that token to generate multiple access tokens for themselves and perform some bad activities on a specific user's account. So I'm going to teach you how to blacklist refresh tokens to the point where they can only be used once. Now, before we do that, we're just going to perform some extra configuration on our um, JWT config. So let's head back to the README file. Now, what we need to do is we need to add some more configuration for Simplejwt. So it says head to the settings page on the documentation. So I will just go back to the documentation and I'm going to head to the settings page. Now, it is important that you open this URL so that you can follow along with me. Now, once I open this settings page, I can see that there is a bunch of code that has been written here for us. So what we're just going to do is, it says copy the Simplejwt configuration and paste in settings.py file. I'm just going to copy this Simplejwt configuration and I'm going to paste it in my settings.py file. So I will scroll to the bottom right here and I'm going to paste it. Now, once I paste it, it's giving us an error because it can't find this library or method. I'm just going to copy it from here, from date time, import time delta, and I will paste it at the top. Now that should get rid of our error. But we have one more, which is right here. Okay, so the next step is we can get rid of signing key as it is not needed. So I'm just going to come here and get rid of signing key. So because it says settings.secret key, but we are already in the settings and the secret key is already defined here. So this is assuming that these configuration files were not pasted, these configurations were not pasted in the settings. So since the secret key is present here, I just get rid of it. Then the next step, according to the README file, is that we need to customize the lifetime of tokens. Now, if we scroll here, we can see two variables called access token lifetime and refresh token lifetime. So what this basically means is how long is this token going to be valid for? That is, when this token is generated, how long should it last? When should the expiration date be? Now we can decide to set this to whatever we want here. For example, I can say I want the access token to be valid for 1 day. So I can say day is equals to 1. Now, once I say day is equals to 1, anytime a new access token is generated, it will only be valid for 24 hours. Now, immediately that 24 hours is up, it's going to be marked as invalid and the user has to generate a new access token because it has expired. Now, the same for refresh token. The refresh token here says, refresh token lifetime here says day is equals 1. Now, it's usually by default And by default, the refresh token should always be more, the expiration time rather, should always be farther than the access token's expiration date. So if my access token lifetime, I mean, is 1 day, I can set the refresh token lifetime to be, let's say, 2 days, for example. So it means that for 2 days straight, I can make use of that refresh token to generate a new access token. So basically, it means that the moment this expires, we can now make use of this refresh token. We can now make use of the refresh token to generate a new access token. But in the case where the access token has expired and the refresh token has expired, now this might happen in a case where the user hasn't visited the website in a while. So the access token that was generated before expires and the refresh token expires also. Now, what that now means is that since both tokens are not valid, the user now has to log in again. Because if I go back to that image, the user now has to log in again to get a fresh set of access and refresh tokens. So that is how this is going to work. So this just basically helps the user from having to log in every time. So we can set the refresh token to be a large number of days, like 30 days, if you don't want the user to have to log in again every time for a whole month straight. What this means is that for a whole month, anytime the access token expires, the refresh token is just going to generate a new access token, and then it is going to um, the access token is going to be generated newly. So that is what these two settings are for. Now, if I go to the README file and scroll down here, it says we need to talk about rotating refresh tokens. Now, if I head to the settings.py file, you can see that rotate refresh tokens right here has been set to false. So before I explain that, let me just set the days to 2. Now let's explain what rotating refresh token means. It says this helps to generate a new refresh token every time a new access token is generated. So what exactly does that mean? When we had generated a new access token using that refresh token, what we saw was only an access token being generated to us. Now, in a case where in a case where the refresh token gets expired, what we want to do is we want to rotate it. Now, what does rotating mean? Rotating means that anytime we generate a new access token using a refresh token, we also want to generate a new refresh token. So let me just show you an example of exactly what I mean again. So I'm going to copy this refresh token and I'll copy it here. Now, let's say we want to generate a new access token. I'm just going to paste the refresh token and click post. Now, once I click post, you can see that the only data that gets returned back to us is the access token. Now, this might be decent, but in a case where we want to keep the user logged in for a very long time, what we can do is anytime we paste in the refresh token to get a new access token, what we want to do is we want to generate a new access token and a new refresh token so that the expiration date for the refresh token keeps pushing because a new refresh token keeps getting generated. So even though we set the expiration date to 2, anytime a new access token is generated, that is after 1 day, when the access token gets generated and it expires. So after 1 day, it's going to expire. Now, what that now means is that when a new access token is generated, a new refresh token is also going to be generated. So that just keeps rolling away the expiration day for both the access token and the refresh token so that we can keep the user logged in for a very long time, as long as the user is active. So if the user is active every single day for a month straight or for even a year straight, it would mean that that user is never logged out because anytime a new access token is generated, a new refresh token is also going to be generated. And using that refresh token, we generate access tokens anytime the access token expires. So that expiration window just keeps rolling away and it keeps pushing further. Now, the only way these two tokens are going to get expired is when the user hasn't been active for a very long time. So it means that the refresh token gets expired, and also the access token gets expired. So that means that the user has to log in again in order to get these two tokens. So if you have any question about that explanation, please just ask a question in the comment section, and I will be happy to help you. So what we're going to do is we're now going to write we're now going to make a change so that a new refresh token is also going to be generated. So all we simply need to do is change rotate refresh tokens to true. Now, once I set this to true, it means that a new refresh token is also going to be generated for us. Now, once I click save, I can just run my server again. We're getting an error. It says type error, day is an invalid keyword. So I think, yeah, this should be days, not day. So once I make that change and run the server, I am just going to test it in right here. So I'm going to copy this refresh token, which was generated. I'll refresh the page. Now, once I refresh the page, I am going to paste that refresh token. Now, once I paste it and click post, notice what happens. You can see that we now not only get an access token, but we also get a refresh token for the token refresh endpoint. So this way, anytime an access token gets expired, it's going to generate a new access token and a new refresh token for us. So this helps keep the user logged into our application for long periods of time, so they don't have to always log in. So after doing that, the next step is that we now need to look at um, okay, we now need to look at blacklisting refresh tokens to prevent reuse. Now, notice that I can copy this refresh token that has been generated newly for us. Once I copy it, I can make use of it here. Now, once I make use of it, you can see that a new access and a new refresh token has been generated for us. But I can still make use of that old refresh token to generate a new access token and a new refresh token. Now, I explained earlier that this is very dangerous because if a malicious person or a malicious party gets access to one of these refresh tokens right now, it means they can generate as many access and refresh tokens as they want. So what we want to do is we want to blacklist a refresh token the moment it is used. So what that means is that the moment we make use of a refresh token once, it can never be used again because it has been blacklisted. So that is what we are going to do now. It says blacklisting refresh tokens to prevent reuse. So what we need to do is set blacklist after rotation to true. So we head back to the setting, and where we see blacklist after rotation, we're going to set this to true so that refresh tokens can only be used once. Now that isn't all we need to do. In order to make sure that our blacklisting of tokens work properly, it says next, according to the documentation, we need to add the following to installed apps. So I will just copy this right here and I'll go to my settings and I'll scroll to the top where we have installed apps and I will paste this here. Now, the reason why we need to add this is because this token blacklist, this thing that we just pasted right here for token blacklisting, it's an application by itself on its own. So what happens is that anytime a new token is generated and a new refresh token is generated and it is used, that is for access and refresh tokens. Anytime they are generated and used, there is a database table that has been created already that stores these tokens and it blacklists them in database. I believe it's a Boolean field to check whether it has been used or not. So when that Boolean field has been set to used or checked or whatever, it means that we can no longer use that token. Now this application which we just added is going to help us keep track of these blacklisted tokens so that they can't be used anymore. So once you add it to the settings in your installed apps, just click save. Now the next step is that we need to run python manage.py migrate. We need to run migrate because this is its own application and it comes with its own database tables and it comes with its own migrations. As you can see, the moment I added it, it says you have 11 unapplied migration. So we're just going to run migrate in order to apply these changes. So you can see that these database tables have been created, token blacklist and all that. I'm just going to clear my screen and run my server again. Sorry. I'll just clear my screen and run the server once more. So once I run the server, what we're just going to do next is that we need to make a request to refresh token endpoints to view the result. So I'm just going to copy this new refresh token that was generated for us. Right? I will copy it and I will paste it in here. Once I paste it in there and click post, you will notice that a new access token and a new refresh token have been generated for us. Now, if I attempt to use that same refresh token, notice what happens. I'm going to click post. Now you can see that it says token is blacklisted. The token isn't valid. So this is exactly what we want to do. We want to make sure that refresh tokens can only be used once. So that is exactly what we have done. So the next step is that we need to return the user data along with tokens. Now let me explain. So right now we have basically done all we need to do in order to authenticate our users. Now, if a user wants to visit a protected route, I'm going to show you exactly how they will do that. But first of all, we are going to create that endpoint. So let's say I want to create a protected route. I'm going to come here. I can come here right now and say from REST framework dot permissions import uh, import permission import is authenticated. Now after importing is authenticated, we now need to also import um the permission classes. So I'm going to say from REST framework.decorators, import permission classes. So what we simply need to do is, or what we want to do is, we want to create an endpoint which is protected. I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to do that. So I'll create a function and I'll just call it my protected route to simulate a protected route. And this is going to take in request, request, and I'm just going to simply return response. And I'll say you have been granted access to my protected route. So this is just to simulate that a user has been granted access. Now, what we need to do is we need to first of all put uh, the request method, which is allowed on this view. I'm going to put get here because we only want to allow get requests to this endpoint. Now, the next thing is that we need to add the permission classes. So I'm going to say the permission classes here is that the user must be authenticated before they can request to these endpoints. I'm just going to pass in is authenticated. So it means that before a user can access these endpoints, they must be authenticated. So I will just create a URL for it right here. And I'm just going to say path, and I'll call it my protected endpoint. And I'm just going to say views dot my protected endpoint. Now, once I do that, I will save it. Now, I want you to notice what happens when I visit this endpoint. I'm just going to come here, create a new tab, and go to localhost port 8000 / my protected endpoint. Now, once I try to visit that URL, notice what it says. It says detail, authentication credentials were not provided. So what that means is that in order to visit this endpoint, we need to provide authentication credentials. Now I am going to open my Postman just to test this specific endpoint out. And I want to show you exactly how we would make use of this access token in order to make a request to these endpoints. So I'll just open my Postman and wait right here. So now that my Postman is open, I'm just going to simulate how we would make a request to that specific endpoint. So I will head to my browser and I will copy that URL. Now I will just paste that URL right here, and I'm going to set the method to to get rather. And once I do that, if I send a request to that specific endpoint, I want you to see what it gives us. It says 401 unauthorized, and that is the status error code. And it says detail authentication credentials were not provided. So if we want to make a request to that endpoint right now, what we're going to do is I'm going to come here, right? And I will generate a new access and refresh token. I'm just going to enter the username and password for the user account. And once I do that, I'm going to copy this access token that has been generated for us. Now, once I copy it, I will head back to Postman and I will go to the authorization tab. Now, under the auth type, I will scroll down and select bearer token. Now, once I do that, all I need to do is in this input field right here where it says token, I'm going to paste that access token which I had just copied. Now, what I can now do is I can now send that request. Now, once I send the request, you can see that it says you have been granted access to my protected route. That is because we passed in the authentication, sorry, we passed in the access token into this endpoint in the headers, and it was sent by Postman, and it came to our endpoint right here, and it's tried to authenticate the user using that specific token. And once you saw that the token was valid, because we had just generated it from here, once you saw that the token was valid, it then returned back the response, which is you have been granted access to my protected route. So I can send it again, and you can see that it gets returned back to us. So this is very, very beautiful. We can now authenticate our endpoints, and we can create protected routes using this, and we can create protected routes which require that a user has to be logged in. So if you want to make a request to this specific endpoint, you have to come to the Postman. Now using Postman, you have to come to Postman, select bearer token, pass in the token. Now you might be wondering why we passed in you might be wondering why we selected bearer token. If we go to the settings.py file, in the configuration which we had copied and pasted right here, if we scroll down, let me just look for it. Um, if we scroll down here, it says auth header types and it said bearer. So that is exactly why we are making use of bearer token. If you want to know more about it, you can just come to the documentation and read a lot more about it to get more understanding. We are going to move on to the next step right now. So the next step is that this is completely optional, by the way. You don't have to do this. But anytime a new token is generated for me, like the way I like to write application, anytime a new user logs in, that is when they come here and fill this form, they put in their login credentials and then they get an access and refresh token back. And what I like to do is anytime they send their login credentials, when those credentials have been authenticated and the credentials are correct, as it is sending the access and refresh token back, I also like to send back the user data. So the username, the email, if there's a profile image, and first name, last name, and any other data associated with the user. So what we can do using simple JWT is that if we head to the URL, you see that we have been given this view by default, this class-based view, token obtain per view. What we can do is, since it's a class-based view, we can actually override it. We can inherit it, and we can override the post method to send more data. I'm going to explain exactly how we're going to do that. So by default, this is what we have done. This token obtain per view just returns back to us only the access and the refresh token right now. Well, what we need to do is we need to return the user object also, or I need to return the user object also. So in your case, if you would like to return not only the access and refresh token, but if you like to return more data in this response, you can follow along with me. So what we need to do first of all is creating a user serializer. Now, because I want to return user data, I need to create a user serializer. So inside my core app, I will just create a new file called serializers.py. serializers.py. Now, once I do this, this is just going to help us serialize the user data before returning it as a response from the endpoint. So it says make the required inputs. So I will just copy all of this and explain exactly what it is. Now, at the top, we're importing model serializer from REST framework.serializers. And what we're importing next is the user class from Django. So from Django.contrib.auth.models, import user, because this is the default user class which you have used so far in this tutorial. But if you have your own user class, you should go ahead and use it. Next, we created a serializer called user serializer, and it inherits from model serializer class, which we included at the top. Now we created a class meta, and then we set the model for this model serializer to be user. And we are saying we want to serialize all the fields. So what that means basically is that we are trying to get all the fields, that is all the data for this specific user. So the username, last name, email, and all that kind of data. So once you do that, just save it. Now the next step is that we need to override the default token obtain view in the views.py file. So the first thing that we need to do is, or the next thing we need to do is we need to make all of these imports. Now I will explain why we are doing this, but just come down to views.py and make all these imports. So the first thing we're doing is we're importing Django.contrib.author module. I'm sorry, we're importing the user class from Django.contrib.author modules. Then we're importing this user serializer, which we just created right here. That's why we said from .serializers, import user serializer. Now, the next thing is that we're importing this token obtain pair view and this token obtain pair view and token obtain pair serializer. Now, let's explain. This token obtain pair view, remember that in the URL, we use it to get the access and refresh token. So what we're simply going to do is we're importing it in our views.py file because we want to override it. And after overriding it, what we want to do is we not only want to return the access and refresh token, but we also want to return the user object. In your case, it might be something else that you want to return when a user logs in. Now, the next thing is we're now importing the token obtain pair serializer. So this is a serializer that basically helps to generate and return those tokens. So if we go into it, you can see that it returns data and data contains the refresh and the access token. So this is the serializer that helps us to return the access and refresh token. So that is why we're importing it, and it comes by default from Simplejwt JWT. Now, the next step that we need to take, according to the README file, is that we now need to override the default token obtain per view in our views.py file. Now, this is kind of a long writing, but just copy it. Let me zoom out a bit. If you aren't following the README file, you can just stop to write all of this, or if you are following it, just copy it and paste it in a views.py file. Now, I am going to explain exactly what it is. So first of all, we have created a new endpoint or a new view called my token obtain pair view. So it's just because we are inheriting from token obtain pair view. That's why we named it my. We added my so that we can differentiate properly. Now, after creating this class and inheriting from this class view that comes by default, we're setting the serializer class to be token obtain pair serializer, which is what we had imported. And this is what comes by default from Simplejwt JWT. Now, the next thing that we did was we created I'm sorry. The next thing that we did is we're overriding the default post request from this view. So if I go to the token obtain pair view, by default, anytime a post request comes in, let's check here. Anytime a post request comes in, it is going to hit this specific place. So what we want to do is we want to override this post request that comes by default from this token obtain pair view. And we want to override it and make use of it in our specific view so that when it is returning the response, we can add whatever we want to that response and return it also. So if we see we're having an error because we don't have token and invalid token imported. Now this is supposed to be called user serializer, not user info serializer. We need to make imports. We need to import token error and invalid token. What I'm just going to do is I'm going to say from REST framework simple JWT dot exceptions import token error and invalid token. Once I make these imports, everything should work fine right now, as you can see. So I'm just going to save it. Now let's explain what is happening. We are overriding the default post request, right? And then what we're doing is this section is going to handle the token generation. So except there's an error, it's going to raise an invalid token error. Now, after the tokens have been generated, this is the response right now. The response object is currently here. Now, what we simply need to do is we want to add data into this response object. So what we're going to do is we're first going to guess the username that came with that post request. Because if we head back to the endpoint, this token view, which is this view that we visit to log in, we have a username field and a password field. And if I go to inspect object right now, so if I go to inspect element, and I inspect that specific form. So once I inspect it, you can see that it has a name attribute of username. So what that means is that anytime we fill this endpoint, this form, and we submit it, It means that in the post request, this endpoint is accepting two post data, which is one has to have a key of username and the other one has to have a key of password. So when that post request comes into this view, we are going to grab the username right here. And we could also grab the password, but then we don't need it. So after grabbing the username, we check if the username, that is, if there's any data in the username. Now, this isn't required, but we can just leave it as it is. Now, after we grab the username and check if any data has actually been gotten from this post request, we now want to check for a user that exists with that username. And after grabbing that user object, what we simply want to do is we want to pass that user object into the user serializer. Now, the serializer, which we had created earlier, is going to grab that data and it's going to serialize that user object. Now, the next step is where we add this user object into the response. Now, here, remember that the response has been created. All we're simply doing here is we're saying response the data of user. So what this means is that we're trying to create a new key inside the response dictionary. So we're trying to create a new key called user, and we're trying to assign it to the user serializer right here, dot data. So we're grabbing the data that we've gotten from user serializer, and then we're assigning it to this new user key in the response data. So that is all we need to do for this specific view. Now, you might also be wondering, but what if this username is wrong and we try to grab that user? This is going to crash. No, it will not crash because it will not crash because that validation happens here. So the username and the password, that validation happens here. So when the program gets here, it won't crash. So for example, let's say I refresh this and I enter invalid login credentials. Let's just say I enter a wrong username and a wrong password. Once I click post right here, you are going to see that it just says no active user accounts found with the given credentials. Now let us actually test to enter the correct username and password. So let's see what we're going to get back. Once I click post right now, you are going to see that we get the refresh token, we get the access token, and we also get that user object. So we get the ID of the user, the password. Obviously, if we wanted to remove this password field, all we have to do is come to the serializer and change this from all to a list, and we can pass in the ID, the first name, the last name, for example, last name, and let's just say email. So instead of saying all, we could technically do this and save it. And once I save it, let's just make sure that the server is running. So what I can now do is I can come back and change this to and put in the proper login credentials. And once I do that, you can see that we only get this object, the user's first name, last name, and email. So basically now we're able to return the refresh token, the access token, and then the user object. So this is very helpful for when you want to return the user objects the moment the user logs in. So a different way you could do it, is you could create a separate endpoint. For example, I could come to the views and I could create a separate protected endpoint. Now that endpoint is basically going to return the authenticated user. So for example, now I can create that endpoint right here and I'm going to call it get user info. And I'll make sure that the user has to be authenticated before requesting this view. So I can now say user is equals to request dot user. Now, after saying user is equals to request to user, we've already grabbed that user object right here. And we can do this because we are sure that in order to access this view, the user has to be authenticated. Now, after doing that, we can now simply come here and copy this serializer. I'm going to say user serializer is equals to user serializer of user. So we can pass in that user object right here. And in the response, all we simply have to do is we can return response of user serializer dot data. So this would be like a different way of doing it. You can create a separate endpoint which helps to grab the user data. So the moment the user logs in from this my token obtain pair serializer, you can then make a request to another endpoint, which is get user info, gets the user's data. But obviously, this is a longer process. And since we can get the user data the moment the user logs in, we can just get rid of this specific view, or I will leave it there for now, just for the tutorial sake. We can just do all of that from this my token obtain pair view serial. That is all we're going to talk about in this tutorial, guys. If you have any question, please leave it in the comment section. And if you want to get the code, there's going to be a link in the description, which will take you to a place, to your repository, a GitHub repository where you can get the code. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.